Although we have been witnessing the rise of many smaller imperialist nations in recent years, Western Europe and the United States are still the main powers exploiting weaker nations economically and militarily for their own gain. Those imperialist core states bribe their respective populations by sharing with them parts of the wealth they stole from so-called third and second world nations. But those bribes alone would never be enough to manufacture consent for the inhumane and immoral foreign policies they pursue. The imperialist core states rely heavily on their media apparatus to spoon-feed their populations exactly those narratives that serve their imperialist interests. Western imperialism, and especially the United States, has a long history of involvement in regime changes, in which it overthrew directly or indirectly foreign governments that opposed its imperialist aspirations. There is one common pattern in particular that we have been seeing in recent years. The imperialist media apparatus rally support for often rather small, local opposition groups that are willing to sell out their country to Western imperialism in case they take power. The Western media portrays their protests and actions as a genuine uprising by the majority of people in that country. They do so in order to discredit its current government internationally and at home, and to justify increasing support for the pro-Western opposition. This is what in recent years arguably happened in Cuba and Hong Kong. But there are also variations of that pattern. In Belarus in 2020, for example, there were genuine protests and strikes supported by a large segment of the population. The United States did not stage those protests, but of course it sought to exploit the situation nonetheless. In cases like this, the imperialist media picks those oppositional groups that are most in line with imperialism's foreign policy goals, and depicts them as the main force behind the protests. They often choose the most reactionary elements of a genuine opposition movement and portray them as the sole legitimate representatives of the whole opposition. This way, all support for the protesting people is being channeled into only those segments that align with Western imperialism. A similar, although slightly more nuanced situation has unfolded in Iran this year. The prevailing Western media narrative looks like this. Following the brutal and unjustified death of a young woman who didn't abide to the strict laws of wearing a hijab, Iranian women are now spearheading unprecedented protests against the mullah regime. We will now explain what is wrong with this narrative and how it serves Western imperialism. It is true that the protests in Iran are genuine and quite significant in its quantity, but it is wrong to say that they were suddenly sparked by the murder of one young woman. Iran's economic situation has been deteriorating for years now. Protests by various segments of the population have already been a daily occurrence long before the death of Mahsa Amini. The protesters' demands have also always been mainly economic in nature, but they do indeed oppose the current regime as a whole. It could be argued that Mahsa Amini's murder was the catalyst for a new wave of protests, but in no way was it their single cause. Neither are the protests feminist in nature, although women do of course play an important part in it. The West only emphasizes the feminist aspect of the protest because it wants to hide the fact that the working people are in fact its main force. Western media wants its viewers to think of this as a middle-class uprising against gender oppression, rather than as a working-class battle against exploitation. At the same time, the West allies with the most reactionary elements of the protests, for example the royalists, hoping to later on establish a new puppet regime in Iran. The examples above teach us an important lesson. The ruling circle of the imperialist countries relies on some of the brightest minds available to them. It is only natural that they have countless different tools and strategies available to exploit any given situation in their favor. That said, to simply ignore the protests in Iran and to denounce them as a Western plot for regime change is just as bad as cheerleading for imperialist puppets like Juan Guaido. Sometimes the media wants you to think that there is an uprising where there is none. Sometimes it tries to hide uprisings from you. And sometimes it wants to obscure the true nature of an uprising. All of this to serve its own interests. That is why it is vital to analyze any given situation very carefully before making judgments. Reality is complex and the ruling class does everything in its power to distract you from the truth.